Hello everybody and welcome to the webinar presentation Selected Imager and Sensor Trends and Comparisons. My name is Scott Parker and I'm here to introduce our presenter and tell you a little bit about TechInsights. Today's presentation will be delivered by Dr. Ziad Shukri, a subject matter expert for image sensor devices at TechInsights. If you would like to submit a question during the presentation, click the chat bubble at the top left of your screen and enter your question in the text box. Questions are not visible to other viewers. We'll provide written responses by email shortly after the webinar. I'll hand it over to Ziad shortly, but first I'd like to provide a short introduction to TechInsights. TechInsights exists to support a fair marketplace where semiconductor and electronics intellectual property can be innovated and monetized. By revealing the innovation others cannot inside advanced technology products, we prove patent value, drive the best intellectual property and technology investment decisions, and provide in-depth supply chain and purchasing analysis. Our analysis spans a wide range of electronic markets and device types, for which we provide various levels of insight, from product teardowns to materials analysis at the atomic level. We offer a suite of subscriptions that are updated frequently with analysis of our latest consumer products. We deliver this content through our feature-rich TechInsights platform and offer additional software solutions that provide unparalleled functionality to explore analysis and to connect technology with the IP landscape. TechInsights is your definitive source for semiconductor analysis. TechInsights offers several image sensor subscriptions, each providing different levels of analysis of imager and sensor devices. The analysis discussed in today's presentation showcases information exclusively from our Device Essentials subscription.
Hi, and welcome to TechInsights webinar on image sensors. In today's webinar, we will present a brief overview of trends and analysis on CMOS image sensors. We will start by looking at smartphone imaging trends of die size, resolution, and pixel pitch. We will show comparisons of CIS small pixel generations, and we'll look at sensor utilization trends for rear-facing and front-facing cameras in mobile phones. We will review characteristics of back deep trench isolation with a closer look at DTI trends by Samsung and Sony. We will also look at trends of high-K dielectrics, color filter arrays, as well as metal grid and phase detection autofocus. Next, we move on to time of flight and show trends analysis on ITOF and DTOF sensors. Then we look at global shutter trends and device comparisons. And finally, we end the webinar with a brief look at Samsung's dynamic vision sensors. We'll start with die size, resolution, and pixel pitch trends. This slide shows Samsung stacked imager die area trend. Here we present data on imagers from 2016 until the present time. And what the graph shows is that there is a general trend of increasing die size. We notice, in fact, two regions here. We see that up to about mid last year, the trend has been of increasing die size, but not a very strong trend. Recently, however, the die size has increased with the advent of the higher resolution 108 megapixel sensors. We believe that the trend was slow to increase because there were two competing effects. So essentially, while sensor resolution was increasing, pixel pitch was also decreasing at the same time. And here we point out that the pixel pitch has essentially scaled from 1.4 microns all the way down to 0.8 microns over the span of about 2.5 or 3 years. So this was an effect counteracting the increase in resolution. On the other hand, more recently, while pixel pitch has decreased down to 0.8 and 0.7 microns, that seems to have reached a plateau, whereas the sensor resolution has increased more drastically. And this explains why we see this recent trend of increasing die size. This slide presents resolution and pixel pitch trends for rear-facing cameras. On the left-hand side, the graph shows sensor resolution versus analysis date. Here, we see that while resolution increased gradually over time, there is a more rapid rise in resolution that occurred recently. And that's with the advent of the 64 megapixel and 108 megapixel sensors. This trend is driven by continued mobile phone camera performance enhancement and also facilitated by advances in sensor design and integration into larger format mobile phones. The right-hand side graph gives pixel pitch versus analysis date. Here again, we see a clear trend of continuously decreasing pixel pitch with time. This is evidenced by the recent release from both Samsung and OmniVision of the 0.7 micron pixel generation sensors. As with the increasing resolution, the pixel shrinkage trend is expected to continue, with Samsung recently announcing the next generation of 0.64 micron pixel pitch for mobile imaging. With that said, however, the continued pixel shrinkage and associated reduction in photodiode volume will certainly encounter some performance challenges, such as maintaining a sufficient full well capacity and maintaining a satisfactory signal-to-noise ratio. The trend is the same for front-facing cameras. So here again, we show resolution on the left-hand side, pixel pitch on the right-hand side as a function of analysis date, and it is clear. So the resolution does increase with time, and recently we have seen in use in mobile phones of 64 megapixel imagers as in the IMX686, and that was in the Redmi K30 shown over here. And in terms of pixel pitch, of course, we know that Samsung has used the 0.7 micron GH1 in their recent flagship phones, so that essentially reaffirms the trends of increasing resolution and decreasing pixel pitch. We now look at small pixel generations of 0.8 and 0.7 microns for mobile applications. Now we look at the 0.8 micron in comparison. So here we're looking at the Samsung GM1, the Sony IMX586, and the OmniVision OV48B. So here we see that Samsung has moved to the ISOCELL Plus technology, whereas Sony and OmniVision continue respectively the quad bear and the 4-cell. No change in the type of chip-to-chip interconnect, although the pitch has changed a little bit from the 0.9. In terms of front metals, there has not been a change, and same thing for back metals. The high-K back dielectrics, Samsung continues to employ the aluminum oxide hafnium oxide. Sony, the same thing, continues to employ aluminum oxide tantalum oxide. And OmniVision, we have analyzed it to be tantalum-based and aluminum-based. In terms of the epi thickness, we see that OmniVision has moved from 3 to 3.6 microns. So this is comparable now to Samsung's and Sony's epi thickness. And in terms of DTI, we see that OmniVision has also moved up from the 1.4 micron partial DTI to 2.2 micron partial DTI. So it's comparable to Sony, but of course not a full isolation as it is with Samsung. And finally, in terms of the transfer gate, OmniVision has moved from planar to vertical transfer gate, whereas Sony remains planar transfer gate as it was with the 0.9 micron. The 0.7 micron pixel generations for Samsung and OmniVision are shown on this slide. On the left-hand side, we show details for Samsung's S5K GW3, while on the right-hand side, we present OmniVision's OV64B. Both sensors have a number of similar characteristics. Die size and process generations are comparable. Both use their respective 2x2 color filter array technologies, tetracell for Samsung and 4-cell for OmniVision, and therefore they both have a 1.4 micron CFA pitch. Samsung utilizes 6 copper front metals, whereas OmniVision has 4 copper interconnect layers plus 1 copper DBI. The back metals and the backside optical stack heights are similar for both. However, in terms of active silicon thickness, it is interesting to see Samsung has a slightly thicker epi of 4.1 microns, whereas OmniVision's at 3 microns. The slightly thicker epi, in the case of the GW3, could be a measure by Samsung to increase full well capacity at this smaller pixel pitch. Finally, we do note both manufacturers continue to use their respective pixel isolation technologies, and that's full front DTI for Samsung and a partial back deep trench isolation for OmniVision. Also, both utilize a vertical gate structure due to the reduced pixel lateral dimension. And finally, it is worthwhile noting here that to date we have not yet seen a 0.7 micron pixel pitch sensor from Sony, although with the increased adoption of this smaller format, we may very well hear an announcement in the near future. And now we would like to present image sensor utilization in flagship smartphones, starting with front camera trends. This slide shows you Samsung's choice for front cameras, and specifically the sensors used. And we do note that if we look at resolution versus pixel pitch, Samsung has chosen for front cameras 2 zones of sensors. So basically, the smaller pixel pitch, higher resolution over here, and the lower resolution, slightly larger pixel pitch shown below. For these sensors, Samsung has relied on the 3J1 and the Sony IMX375, whereas for the smaller pixel pitch, higher resolution sensors, Samsung, of course, has introduced the GH1, and they have also utilized the IMX616 from Sony. Huawei's front camera trends looks a little bit more broad. Huawei, of course, relies heavily on the IMX616, and we see that over here. But they have also introduced other lower resolution, higher pixel pitch on their flagship phones. For Apple, we know that Apple relies and continue to rely on lower resolution images, and that is still the case. So here we see that Apple has adhered to the 1 micron pixel pitch and 12 megapixel resolution for their iPhone 12 series that they have recently released, which they have done so also for their past flagship phones, the iPhone 11 series and the XR. Xiaomi's front camera trend is relatively straightforward, so they focus only on smaller pixel pitch and resolution between 20 and 32 megapixels. Oppo's trend looks quite interesting because they have sourced essentially a number of pixel pitches and resolutions. So here we see, of course, Oppo also uses the 0.7 micron pixel pitch, the GH1 from Samsung, as well as the IMX616 from Sony, the GD1 from Samsung. So next we will look at rear camera trends. And the strategy for Samsung for rear cameras is quite interesting. For Samsung, we see that they have focused strongly on the 0.8 micron pixel pitch, and they use different resolutions ranging from 48 megapixels to the 108 megapixel in their flagship phones. And in terms of the low resolutions, those tend to be around 60 megapixel with varying pixel pitch. Huawei's rear cam trend is somewhat similar, at least for the higher resolution sensors. So here we see Huawei utilizing the IMX686 from Sony, as well as the OmniVision 48B from by OmniVision. And for the lower resolution cameras, they still maintain the 40 megapixel sensors from Sony IMX608, as well as the IMX586, and they also utilize OmniVision's OV8856 here at the 8 megapixel range. Apple, of course, adheres to the 12 megapixel resolution sensors, and this is not a surprise. They have maintained that also for their flagship phones, the iPhone 12 series released recently. For Apple, they utilize, of course, the 1.4 pixel pitch sensors for their main wide cams, while they utilize the 1 micron pixel pitch for the ultra-wide and telephoto. Xiaomi's rear cam strategy is rather broad. While they also show 2 zones of utilization of sensors, it is still fairly broad. And here we also notice that Xiaomi sources from Sony, OmniVision, and Samsung as well. Of course, they have introduced the GW1 in their flagship phones, as well as the IMX686 as the 64 megapixel 0.8 micron sensors. For Oppo, the situation is somewhat similar to Xiaomi. Again, they have a rather broad strategy, and they cover sensors from 64 megapixels all the way down to 8 megapixels, as well as the sourcing from different vendors. Oppo rely on Sony, OmniVision, and Samsung. Next, we would like to briefly comment on image signal processors. This slide shows recent Samsung mobile stacked ISP die. Here we show the ISP associated with the GH1 sensor, the GM1, the GW1, and the HMX sensors. What we would like to note here first is that all die are, the images are to scale here, so the size is really of increasing order. And it's interesting that since the pixel pitch of the CIS is relatively, or is the same with the exception of the GH1, the die size scales with resolution, going from approximately 44 megapixels all the way up to 108 megapixels. And this is, of course, is expected. The other thing to note is Samsung's use of the 28 nanometer process shown here. So on all sensors with the exception of the GM1, as well as the utilization of 8 copper metal layers in the ISP process, again on all sensors with the exception of the GM1. And a final thing to note, which is noteworthy here, we do observe that the ISP cell, or the active cells, does not cover the entire surface. So during our analysis, when we made those observations highlighted over here, we were under the impression that this may have been an artifact of deprocessing, but upon closer examination, it is not. It is truly partial utilization of the ISP active surface. We note that because we have not observed any new use of triple stack die. In fact, what we have observed recently is the continued use of Samsung's 2L3 in the flagship phones. So in this timeline, essentially, we are highlighting of what's next for the triple stack die. We do believe that with the advent of increased demand on image processing and in terms of AI algorithms and smart sensors, one would expect that there should be and probably will be recent releases of triple stack die for imagers. Next, we look at back deep trench isolation. This slide shows observed use of back deep trench isolation for all documented manufacturers and all applications. Here, the blue highlight represents the thickness of the deep trench isolation, and the orange highlight represents silicon remaining above the deep trench isolation. So essentially, the two together show the total thickness of the DTI. In general, we notice that for the majority of the sensors and applications, the target silicon thickness appears to be in the range of 3 microns. That said, of course, we have observed some new sensors highlighted on the left-hand side over here, such as the Sony SPAT sensor and the Apple iPad Pro LiDAR, and that has a thickness of 7 microns, and it is a full back deep trench isolation. We've observed the same for the OmniVision A1B sensor for improved near-infrared performance. It is also a full back deep trench isolation. The other thing to note is that the smaller pixel pitch sensors have not had a significant change in thickness overall. And also to note that if we look at the numbers over here, the ratio of DTI over the entire silicon thickness is about 60%. Of course, since this is a large collection of data, there are a number of sensors that had a very shallow DTI. So these are shown, for example, here and here. And there are sensors, as we've stated, that have a full deep trench isolation, but the average ratio of DTI to full thickness is in the range of 60%. Next, we look at Sony back deep trench isolation. So this is Sony small pixel active silicon, and here we have two graphs: active silicon versus date, and that would be conventional, and active silicon where back deep trench isolation is in use, and that would be the graph on the right-hand side over here. The message here is that obviously with the introduction of back deep trench isolation, one is able to increase the silicon thickness without sacrificing performance. Additional data is reported here for 2020, and we can see that in general, well, it falls in the same trend. Now we'll look at Samsung's back deep trench isolation. So this slide shows a summary of sensors that have been recently analyzed that did contain back deep trench isolation. There is nothing that we have observed in 2020, but we have chosen 4 outlined here and with SEM cross-section presented here. So basically for Samsung, we notice that in general, the range of the partial DTI is comparable to Sony. And in this case, we are pointing out, for instance, the 2L3, which is a 1.4 micron pixel. It has a DTI to active silicon ratio of 74%. For the 2L1, 1.4 micron pixel, the ratio is a little bit different, 58%. More recently, the 3J1 sensor, which is a dual photodiode, it had a ratio of 69% DTI to active silicon. And now we change the topic a little bit and we look at back illuminated imagers, high K dielectric trends. The high K back dielectric trends for Sony is shown here. And this is a graph that represents sensor or technology introduction versus time. So here we have looked at all of the sensors indicated here on the chart, and they are grouped by the type of back high K dielectric. And what we see is that Sony has started with hafnium oxide and then introduced tantalum oxide, and recently, with the exception of the IMX424, but recently being since about 2015, they have adhered to aluminum oxide and tantalum oxide as the high K dielectric materials. And this, of course, is the case for recent sensors listed all here. We can see, for instance, the IMX 516 depth sense imager, the 586 Exmor RS, and recently the iPad Pro LiDAR sensor. For Samsung's dielectric trends, that is shown here. So we see again that Samsung similarly started off with hafnium oxide and then transitioned into introducing multiple dielectric layers, including hafnium oxide, silicon oxide, so a sandwich stack. But recently they have also introduced aluminum oxide, but retained hafnium oxide. So that is a difference from Sony in that Samsung uses a sandwich structure of aluminum oxide, hafnium oxide, and silicon oxide. And again, the highlighted sensors are shown here. So for instance, the 3J1 that we've just reported on, and the GM1, both of which are ISOCELL Plus. Now we look at color filter arrays. Here we show the introduction timeline for quad Bayer, tetracell, and 4-cell. The graph on the left presents pixel pitch versus analysis date. The table on the right shows devices analyzed in 2020. For this year, we see that there is a rather large spread in pixel pitch for these 2x2 CFAs. Starting from the smallest, which is, of course, the Samsung's GH1, 0.7 micron pixel, and a tetracell pixel pitch of 1.4 microns, up to OmniVision's 1.4 micron pixel pitch and a 2.8 micron CFA pixel pitch for cell technology. So what we can say is that not only this technology has been adopted for a small pixel to enhance the overall sensitivity, but it is also being used for larger pixel pitch where the need for higher signal is there. And now we turn to back metal grid structures. So in terms of back metal choices, we are comparing Sony, Samsung, OmniVision, SK Hynix, and ON Semiconductor. So here we see that in terms of back metal, all, with the exception of Samsung, utilize tungsten for the back illuminated light shield as well as for the grid. Samsung only uses tungsten for the light shield, but not for the grid. Now let's look at phase detection autofocus, or PDAF. The pixel pitch trend versus year of analysis for Sony is shown here. As we said, all three technologies are in use by Sony. Now recently for 2020, Sony has introduced the Octa PDAF in the IMX700 with a 1.2 micron pixel pitch. This, of course, the Octa PDAF is a dual photodiode PDAF method. Sony has also introduced the 2x2 on-chip lens in the IMX689 for the 0.8 micron pixel pitch, as shown here. Therefore, it will be interesting to see as the technology scales to smaller pixel pitch if Sony relies more on on-chip lens towards smaller pixels. One would think in terms of manufacturability, the on-chip lens would be easier to scale down to smaller pixel pitch than dual photodiode. For Samsung, the PDAF trend is shown here. Here for 0.8 micron pixel pitch, we see that Samsung uses both 2x2 on-chip lens technology and the HM1 nanocell, as well as mass PDAF in the GD1. And these are shown here for the GD1, mass PDAF, and the nanocell is shown here. Of course, the trend for Samsung is the same, and it is to be determined if on-chip lens will also continue to be the choice for smaller pixel pitch. And finally, for OmniVision, as we said, OmniVision only uses mass PDAF and on-chip lens. So, as shown in this graph, they too have introduced 2x2 on-chip lens for 0.8 micron technology over here for the OV48B. And we have not observed their use of mass PDAF recently, this year, below 1.4 micron pixel pitch, although they have previously used it for 1 micron pixel pitch. Next, we look at dual photodiode comparisons. So here we are looking at Sony's IMX555 and IMX700 in comparison to Samsung's S5K 3J1 sensor. So the IMX555 is a full array dual photodiode with bare RGB. The IMX700, as we said, is the newer Octa photodiode autofocus. Also a full array with red, yellow, yellow, blue, quad bare. In both cases for Sony, we see that the structure of the photodiode is somewhat similar. In other words, the division of the photodiode is partial, as we see it here, and it's along a single axis of the sensor. Samsung, on the other hand, has a rather complex approach to dual photodiode. Here we see Samsung's approach consists of a block of 4 pixels, a repeating block, a single diode pixel, 2 diagonal pixels that are dual photodiodes, and a 4th pixel which is a quadruple photodiode. This, of course, enabled Samsung to achieve PDAF in both directions, both axes of the sensor. Interestingly enough, it also demonstrates Samsung's capability to create small, intricate pixel features that are in the range of 0.6 microns, as this pixel is 1.22 pixel pitch, and therefore its division in this manner certainly is in the range of 0.6 microns. So that raises the question, could this be the next step for Samsung, that is to say, a 0.6 micron pixel pitch? Now we look at time-of-flight trends for mobile small pixel. First, we look at die size trend for TOF sensors. This graph gives die size as a function of year of analysis for combined iToF and dToF sensors that we've looked at. iToF sensors are shown in blue, and the dToF direct time-of-flight sensors are shown in brown over here. In general, we can see that for iToF sensors, there is a tendency for decreasing die size with time. However, for dToF sensors in brown, the trend is not so clear. Lately, the analysis that we performed, highlighted in the green dashed line over here, together seem to suggest that iToF sensors' die size appear to be decreasing, whereas the dToF sensors, and specifically these are SPAD arrays, are increasing. So how do we reconcile this? Well, one thing that we can note is that this seems to be vendor dependent. In other words, different vendors adopt their own designs and their own choices. For Microsoft, for instance, there has been a significant decrease in die size. Infineon PMD had a small die size in 2016, but then they've produced a larger die as well as an equivalent size die. For STMicro, for direct ToF, their SPAD sensors are a small footprint sensor, and those were aimed for proximity sensors, mobile applications, so space restrictions. Although with time there is an increasing demand on resolution, and we see the Sony LiDAR that has just been introduced that has a greater resolution, therefore also greater die size. Here we show the back illuminated time-of-flight trend for active silicon thickness. While only a few data points are shown, there is an apparent trend for active silicon thickness to increase, shown here for Sony and Microsoft sensors. For time-of-flight, Sony does not use any specific features to enhance near-infrared absorption, the wavelengths used in time-of-flight, and so there is reliance on thicker silicon layers for improving the quantum efficiency. Samsung introduced a time-of-flight sensor this year, which we will review later on in this chapter, that takes advantage of certain design features to improve the signal absorption. And so its thickness is not very high, 3.4 microns. So in general, it is not clear if the silicon thickness trend will be maintained. One would expect that it will be, but it's clear that sensor design also plays an important role in achieving a high performance, high QE sensor. Here we show the trend for resolution for time-of-flight sensors. This graph gives resolution or pixel count versus year of analysis. We present ITOF and DTOF separately. ITOF is in blue, and direct time-of-flight sensors resolution is in brown. And the first thing that we can note on this graph is that the resolution for ITOF sensors, in general, it's larger than for DTOF sensors. It also seems to suggest that there is a tendency for resolution to increase for ITOF sensors. And one could even think that there are two trends, the mainstream sensors over here, as well as emerging sensors over here. For DTOF, on the other hand, these have typically been small SPAD arrays for proximity sensing by ST microelectronics and AMS. And so those will probably continue to be in the low resolution range, but we believe they themselves will also head towards slightly larger arrays. Notably, the Sony iPad Pro LiDAR, which is a direct time-of-flight sensor, is a little bit larger than the ST microelectronics sensors. So in summary, this will be highly application dependent, and with the increased focus on Face ID, for instance, biometrics, we will probably see higher resolution sensors emerging as suggested by this graph. Now we look at time-of-flight pixel pitch. Here what we observe from the data we've obtained through our analysis is that there is a clear trend of decreasing pixel pitch. Now, this is most likely due to two factors. There's a demand for higher resolution, and with higher resolution, the array footprint becomes important, so the pixel pitch or the pixel size has to be reduced. There's also, of course, a concern with reducing pixel pitch in terms of signal-to-noise ratio, but we believe that those will be addressed through other means, such as enhancing detection using different enhancement of IR absorption for time of flight. So in conclusion, for pixel pitch, we do see a decreasing trend, and we are highlighting here what we can expect to see from the vendors that we have analyzed. Finally, here we show the trend for time-of-flight sensor pixel architecture complexity. So the graph shows transistors per pixel versus year of analysis. So here the trend is not very clear. The different vendors certainly have different approaches for pixel design. So if we look, for instance, at Sony alone, we can see that the number of transistors per pixel have really not progressed or increased. If we look at new entrants, there's new site imaging here that has a very simple pixel architecture, 6 transistors per pixel that focuses on lower power consumption. Samsung, on the other hand, has introduced a 32 transistor per pixel, and this is a 4-tap pixel design, so more complex. And the intent here is for improved performance. At the end, it will be a question of a compromise between performance and power considerations. And now let's look at global shutter trends. Here we show effective transistors per pixel. So as we can see in this graph, there has been a continuation of the number of effective transistors per pixel, and this is shown at the bottom of the graph over here, highlighting the recent analysis on the IMX540 and the OmniVision A1B. We have also analyzed sensors as in the Samsung 33D that had a significant number of transistors. There's no pixel sharing in this case, and this is what we see on in terms of the higher number of transistors per pixel. So overall, the trend is a continuation of what has been observed previously. Here we show a pixel pitch trend. So again, there is a continuation in the pixel pitch trend. In this case, it is a gradually decreasing pixel pitch. We have also included a previously published graph that reported data from 1990 to 2010. And here, both rolling and global shutter are summarized. On the right-hand side, it is only global shutter. And we have highlighted the recent analysis done. So the trend here is a gradually decreasing trend. In terms of resolution for sensors with global shutter, here we note that most sensors analyzed were in the range of 5 megapixels and below. Only 2 devices in the dataset were at 25 megapixels. However, one can expect that an increasing number of the higher resolution sensors will adopt global shutter instead of rolling shutter, particularly with the increased utilization of stacked imagers. Here, there will be more flexibility to implement per pixel storage elements on the ISP side as pixels get smaller and smaller. So we believe that the increasing resolution trend will also apply to global shutter. Now let's look at back illuminated global shutter. So this is back illuminated monolithic global shutter. Here we compare SmartSense, Microsoft, and Samsung. The pixel architectures are a little bit different between the three, but it is noted that SmartSense and Samsung is voltage domain, indicated over here, and they all have no pixel sharing, as indicated over here. We also see that SmartSense uses 9 transistors per pixel, Microsoft 12, and Samsung's 32. In terms of stacked global shutter, here we're looking at OmniVision, SmartSense, and Sony. Again, we see that the pixel architectures are different between the three. For OmniVision and SmartSense, they're both voltage domain. No shared pixels, as seen over here. And OmniVision uses 5 transistors, whereas SmartSense 9. For Sony, this is a charge domain, stacked, and it is 4 shared pixels with 20 transistors, so 5 effective transistors per pixel. We note here in the schematic the in-pixel storage, the capacitors, and it is also noted on the pixel planar SEM, we can see the shielding over here of the charge per pixel. This is better seen on the cross-section. Again, this is shielding metal to essentially protect the stored charge from parasitic light. Here, if we look at the in-pixel capacitor type, it's an interdigital in metal 1 for OmniVision. It's a metal insulator metal for SmartSense that's implemented through metals 4 and 5. And for Sony, it is 1 storage node per pixel. And now we would like to turn our attention to dynamic vision sensors. Dynamic vision sensors, also known as event-based sensors, are gaining significant interest for their asynchronous high operating speed and for their lower power consumption characteristics. We have previously analyzed Samsung's S5K231, which we will present next, but let's first look at Samsung's DVS roadmap. If we look at the Samsung Dynamic Vision Sensor roadmap, so Samsung has developed the first generation of dynamic vision sensors in 2014, and those are VGA 9 micron pixel. Then they have introduced in 2016 generation 2, also VGA 9 micron pixel. To our knowledge, those were the developmental products. In 2018, they have released the generation 3 product, VGA 9 micron as well, and that's the S5K231XY, which we have analyzed, as mentioned. And they have on their roadmap the fourth generation, a 1 megapixel, 4.95 micron pixel pitch sensor that we will be looking forward to. If we do a quick overview of the Samsung sensor that we've analyzed, the S5K231. So here we show the dye photograph, the module base, and the microlens array. This is, of course, monochrome. There is a metal shield or grid with small overtures that is below the microlens that can be seen here. And we also show the polyphoto of the pixel structure. This is a planar photo. So basically this is a back illuminated sensor. It's a 19 nanometer node, 0.3 micron resolution. It's a 9 micron pixel pitch, as we stated, and the silicon thickness is 2.5 microns thick. And with this, we end today's webinar. To learn more about TechInsights products offerings, please visit www.techinsights.com. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we thank you for watching.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, Ziad, and thank you to everyone who took the time to be with us here today. We have just a few more things for you before we wrap up. Firstly, if you've submitted any questions during the webinar, we'll follow up with you shortly by email. Today's presentation featured TechInsights image sensor analysis. TechInsights offers a wide range of image sensor analysis subscriptions that provide regular, succinct analysis of high volume and emergent imaging and optical sensing applications. Why choose TechInsights? Founded in 1989, TechInsights offers an unparalleled combination of the latest technologies and analytical techniques, knowledgeable subject matter expertise in the broadest range of technologies, and the world's largest database of semiconductor analysis created over 30+ years of operation. We serve our global clients from our headquarters in Ottawa, Canada, as well as from a number of satellite locations around the world. If you would like to learn more about TechInsights image sensor technology subscriptions, you can email us at info@techinsights.com or visit our website, www.techinsights.com. Thank you for joining us today. Once the presentation is ended, you will see a short survey. If you can spare a few minutes, we would really appreciate your feedback. On behalf of Ziad and all of us here at TechInsights, thank you very much and have a great day.